I'm following the committee's lead here, and UCLA is still number one. Yukon's out of the running for a number one seed, but Yukon did beat South Carolina. We all remember that. It was a few days later, a little hard for me to fathom what I witnessed. I still like South Carolina to make the Final Four. I've come to learn that betting against Dawn Staley is a fool's errand. I'm Charlie Creme, and you're checking in with Women's Hoops Network.
So first, Charlie, just tell us about your title, and what that consists of.
Okay, so bracketology is something that started by using that term anyway. Oh, geez, I think around 2000 on the men's side. I think Joe Lenardi, if anybody is familiar with men's college basketball, is the one who kind of started it. But he started it independently, and then ESPN really enjoyed seeing the content and decided to bring it into the fold for the .com side, and then it's sort of evolved after a few years. They added it on the women's side. That's where I came in. My relationship with Joe and his relationship that had just started with ESPN, and I became sort of the natural fit to take over on the women's side. And essentially what bracketology is what Joe and I and many others are now around the country are doing is we're trying to forecast what the bracket will look like on Selection Sunday, be it men or women's college basketball. And we do it try to do it from the perspective of the committee. So we do it what we think the committee would be doing based on the metrics, based on watching a lot of basketball, which the committee members do, as well as us. And then, try to give fans a kind of a sense of where their team may be seated, may be playing, who they may be playing, and it kind of takes a snapshot of the season as it is on that particular day as to what the bracket might look like. It's not a predictor of who's going to win the tournament. It's not even necessarily a predictor or an analysis of what we would do personally in terms of seeding and placement in the bracket. It's more we try to follow as closely as we can the process that the committee undertakes to put together the bracket, and then apply that to a bracket on that whatever particular day we're putting one together, which at this time of year is essentially every day or every other day.
How many people, is there a ballpark number of how many people are actually involved in the committee when it comes to, doing the brackets or putting those, rankings in order as far as bracketology goes?
Yeah, well, with a committee, the actual NCAA committee is comprised of 12 people. Used to be 10, now it's 12, on both the men's and women's side. They meet all throughout the college basketball season. And the committee members are usually they're athletic directors at institutions, maybe assistant athletic directors. Typically, that's who they are. And in some cases, it's a former coach who maybe now is in athletic administration. And they meet usually via Zoom calls or Teams meetings or something like that during the course of the year. They get together, I think, a couple of times during the season as well. They all have sort of assigned regions of the country, teams that they're focused on that they can kind of bring back information on to the rest of the committee. And then the nitty gritty becomes they get together that last weekend or about 4 days in Indianapolis before Selection Sunday and really start putting it together. And it's what their process is really just a series of votes. They use the metrics to kind of group teams, and then they all take votes. So they'll take a group of 8 teams, for instance, right at the top, and then they vote as a 12-person committee on and then the top 4 in that vote get placed on the number 1 line, and then they take the remaining 4 teams, throw them back into the pot, grab another group of teams, put those together, vote again, and so on and so forth until they have all their seed lines. And of course, they have their automatic bids. Teams they know that are in the tournament. And with those teams, they just have to figure out where we're going to place them in the bracket and how we're going to seed them.
And mentioning the bracket, there's like first 4 out, 4 buys. Could you explain what that means? Like, especially with the buys, what does that mean? And then like your first 4 out, last 4 in. How does that work, and what's that terminology?
Okay, great. So the first 4 out, last 4 in is something that we kind of created as terminology in the bracketology world to let people know these are the last 4 teams that are in the field. So they're not particularly safe depending on what course of the season we're in. And these are the teams that are just barely on the outside looking in. So those are the teams that, generally speaking, can do a lot of swapping, or or teams that are just close to making it, or close to not making it. And essentially it puts a list together so fans can see, okay, my team's closer. And it creates a lot of discussion amongst fan bases too. Oh, what do you mean we're in the first 4 out? We should be in the tournament. We have this, this, and this. And likewise, I get a lot of phone calls from teams, media members that cover teams that are on the bubble, that are maybe just barely in the tournament. Well, what does so and so have to do to solidify their spot in the field? And so we kind of start breaking down the remaining schedule and say, this is the bare minimum I think that would get them in, but all of any one singular team is dependent on other teams, right? Because it's kind of a race to 68, and then so that number 68, to answer the first part of your question, a few years ago they added 4 teams to create the some people refer to it as play-in games. It's really called the first 4 because teams aren't really playing in anything. They're in the tournament. It's a 68 team field. But what it created was a few more spots, and so they get 4 games out of it. It's the last 4 teams in the field as at-large bids. Typically, they're 11 seeds, sometimes 12 seeds, and those 4 will play each other to see who moves into the main bracket. And then the last 4 teams in the field. So generally, those are the automatic bids from smaller conferences or teams that maybe finished 5th or 6th in a league in the regular season, but won the conference tournament. So their record's not very good. Their net rating's not very good. And those 4 teams will play each other to move into the main bracket. But it gives more opportunity to a few more at-large teams than we had before. And it creates a few more games to be played on. In the case of the women, on Wednesday and Thursday, we get games instead of having to wait till Friday for the main draw to start.
Okay, so now that we've gotten into how the selecting works, what the terminology is, let's talk about now. Of course, UCLA was number 1 up until, this new rankings came out, and now we have Notre Dame at number 1. Of course, there's some debate saying that they felt that UCLA could have stayed at number 1 because they only had 1 loss to a top 5 opponent versus, moving Notre Dame, who has 2 losses, one of those being to an unranked opponent. Does Notre Dame's win streak have anything to do with them moving to number 1, and UCLA, although they have 1 loss, being now moved to number 3?
Sure. I mean, a couple of things on that. First, a lot of things go into where the committee places its teams. Win streaks are certainly a big part of it because one of the designated criteria that the committee uses is kind of early results versus late results. So obviously Notre Dame is having as much success as anybody, maybe the most success of anybody right now in what we're currently seeing. That said, the AP poll, top 25 poll, has no bearing on the selection process for the committee. So while Notre Dame is number 1 in the AP rankings, I still have UCLA as number 1 on my big board. The committee looks at things. You hear the term body of work, full body of work, and the committee is definitely taking a look at the season as a whole. A lot of times the AP poll can be prisoner of the moment stuff, and here's why. So the committee released what it felt like was its top 16 a few days ago, as it stood right now. Now, of course, that same day, a whole bunch of stuff happened and messed it all up. And that in the AP poll, that's kind of what allowed Notre Dame to move to number 1. But the committee, even after UCLA's loss to USC, still had the Bruins number 1. So that tells me that they would have stayed number 1 had the release been a few days later, even because UCLA's next game that came Sunday against Michigan State was a win. So I'm following the committee's lead here, and UCLA is still number 1. And in fact, the committee also had Texas ahead of Notre Dame. And then just after that release of the top 16, Texas beat LSU. Of course, Notre Dame beat Duke the following night on Monday. Duke's an impressive win, but it's not as impressive based on all the numbers as Texas beating LSU. So Texas certainly is not going to fall behind Notre Dame after that. So in fact, I have UCLA 1, Texas 2, Notre Dame 3, whereas that's mixed up in the AP poll. But I think it's important for people to remember that the AP poll the committee doesn't use that. It's not a piece of criteria that's utilized. And quite honestly, thank goodness, because I tend to disagree with the AP voters quite a bit because as I mentioned, they tend to be prisoner of the moment. Oh, Notre Dame or UCLA just lost. We got to drop them. Not necessarily. If their cushion was big enough and they created a big enough cushion with no losses heading into that USC game, whereas everybody else had at least 2, then other than LSU, then there's enough to keep them number 1 after even just one singular loss.
There are only 3, maybe 4 games for some teams left until they get to their conference tournament. So let's say, for example, South Carolina, they win every game through the SEC tournament. Like they win the rest of the conference games, they win their tournament. Would this put them back? Because it seems now that they took that huge loss to Yukon, big deficit at home, they could now have possibly slipped to a number 2. Would them winning their conference tournament put them back at a 1 seed? And this is a 2-part question. Would that put them at a number 1 seed? But if LSU and Texas, who are in their conference as well, they win the rest of their games, get to the conference tournament, let's say it's South Carolina and LSU, not Texas. Considering LSU and Texas would now have the same number of losses, would this move LSU up and then move Texas down to a different seeding? How do you guys factor things like that in with such a tough conference, the SEC and the Big Ten for that matter?
Well, you raised the big question, right? What happens in this last week and a half and in the conference tournament is going to determine all of that. And so to play out your scenario, we'll just take South Carolina as the example, and we can kind of build on that. Right now, I still have South Carolina as a 1 seed, but I have them as the final 1 seed. And I've been mentioning all along, UCLA and South Carolina, they were 1-2, and they had cushion. They had room for error. Well, South Carolina just used all of that room for error. It's gone. So I think South Carolina is probably going to have to run the table, which includes winning the SEC tournament to stay number 1, because the likelihood, and you brought it up, the likelihood of if they lose is going to be another team they're competing with for a number 1 seed. Also, we have to factor in what happens with USC and UCLA in the Big Ten. If those two get to the conference final and USC win, well, and yet they have to play each other again in the regular season as well. So we're going to see potentially 2 more matchups between those two. But what if USC sweeps? Well, that's going to knock UCLA out. That's going to open up another spot on the 1 line right now, which could be USC's. It could be LSU's if LSU wins the SEC tournament. Mm-hmm. So all of these things are intertwined. But for South Carolina in particular, as I said, they don't have any more they don't have any more cushion. So I think running the table and winning the SEC tournament is going to be a must. If they do that, for sure they're going to be a number 1 seed, because the SEC is the toughest conference in the country, and they will. In order to do so, they would have to be Kentucky still. They play them in the regular season, and they probably will have to have beaten either LSU or Texas, and potentially both, depending on how the standings all shake out. I mean, Texas could end up with the number 1 seed in the NCAA, or Texas could end up with the number 1 seed in the SEC tournament. South Carolina, the number 2 seed, LSU, the number 3 seed. That would mean that South Carolina in the semifinals would be lined up to play LSU, beat LSU, lined up to play Texas in the final. If they beat those 2 teams, the resume is significantly elevated. There's no question South Carolina would be a number 1 seed. But if they lose to one of those teams, especially if it's in the semifinals, they won't be a number 1 seed. And one of those other 2 teams, that SEC championship game could be for a number 1 seed, depending on what else happens before that and what happens, as I said, with USC and UCLA. And but really, those are the teams we're talking about. I still think, UConn's kind of on the periphery there after the beating South Carolina. And I said a while back that UConn's, they're out of the running for a number 1 seed. And I still largely believe that. But there are probably some scenarios. It would require some upsets that we're not even talking about to get UConn. Because remember, this is where the body of work thing comes in, right? While UConn did beat South Carolina, we all remember that it's still a few days later a little hard for me to fathom what I witnessed. The thoroughness of what UConn beat South Carolina. But UConn also lost to USC and lost to Notre Dame, and then they had that loss to Tennessee. So 2 of the teams that they would have to bump to get past to be a number 1 seed were games they lost. That can't be discarded, and it won't be discarded when the final evaluations are being made. So that's why I find it's going to be difficult for UConn because they don't play anybody the rest of the season. Other than Creighton, they don't play a team that's even remotely NCAA worthy, and that's going to include. So they might play Creighton twice, but that's not enough to exercise the losses to USC and Notre Dame and elevate them past these other teams who are all going to be playing everybody else in the mix is going to be playing a marquee game 2 or 3 the rest of the way.
Sure. And then speaking about conference tournaments too, we know you just went to Yukon, South Carolina. Are you planning to attend any of the conference tournaments as well, just to kind of, I guess I say scout for lack of a better word, or just to see, kind of help in deciding, especially those lower seedings?
That's a great question. So I was actually at Yukon, South Carolina the other day, which was a nice treat. Typically, I am sent to the SEC tournament. That's still to be determined this year. Every year, the powers that be at ESPN make a decision of where I'm best utilized. And with the SEC network, ESPN broadcasts the whole thing. Well, this year there's going to be a full broadcast of the ACC tournament and the Big 12 tournament. So they may either shuffle me around or play me in one place and just have everybody kind of come to me. But I have gone to the SEC tournament in years past for 2 reasons. One, I mentioned it, ESPN with the SEC network broadcast day 1 to right to the championship game. The second thing is that the SEC usually has a lot to do with how the seedings shake out. And this year, in years past, there's been the bubble teams in the SEC, so we talk about them the early part of the tournament. And then when we get to kind of the end of the tournament, everything's sort of settled. Those bubble teams have either won, advanced, or lost and taken themselves out of the running, or are now waiting to see what happens around the rest of the country. This year, the SEC has nothing to do with the bubble. They're going to get 10 teams in the tournament, and they won't get more, and they're not going to get less. However, the top 16, which we haven't talked about yet, where the teams who end up in the top 16, which is why the committee does the reveals of a top 16, why they pick that number. Those teams, they're the top 4 seeds in each region, get to host first and second round games, which is obviously a big deal to the institution, to the program getting to play at home. It's obviously an advantage that you don't have to travel. You get your home fans there. So it's a big deal. Well, the SEC, right now they have Kentucky, Tennessee, and Oklahoma just in the top 16, and Alabama and Ole Miss just on the outside of the top 16. So those games, once we get to probably the quarterfinals of the SEC tournament, are going to be massive to decide that. And then we've already hit on the number 1 seeds, LSU, Texas, South Carolina. When we get really deep into the tournament, the semifinals and the finals, those games are going to be massive to determine who ends up on the 1 line, who ends up on the 2 line. So the SEC this year is going to have a lot to do with some of the most important pieces to the puzzle for the committee and what that bracket ultimately looks like. I think the SEC, maybe the most impressive thing about when we talk about the best conference in the country, isn't the 10 bids, because the Big Ten is actually going to get more bids. But the SEC is probably going to end up with 6 teams in the top 16.
Wow.
That is a testament to how good the teams are within the SEC, within the upper echelon of the SEC, that they're going to make up more than a quarter of significantly more than a quarter of the top 16 and getting to host those games.
Do you have your own predictions of maybe your Final Four?
We would usually do that after we get the bracket, but we certainly talk about it now. That's certainly okay. Well, but here's the thing. I'm going to probably hedge my bets a little bit with this answer because because those top 6 to 7 teams are really hard to differentiate this year. I am going to say I still like South Carolina to make the Final Four. I've come to learn that betting against Dawn Staley is a fool's errand. So I'm gonna put South Carolina on one of those lines. I really do like UCLA's team if Lauren Betts is fully healthy. If her foot/toe injury is still a problem lingering as we get into March, then I'm not so sure. But if they're whole, I certainly like UCLA to make the Final Four as well. The one team I'm going to bet against, and Vic Schaefer probably will call me out on this if I'm wrong, because he's done that before. He's great, by the way. I'm going to say Texas is not going to make the Final Four. I'm kind of doing this I'm kind of doing process of elimination and sliding teams in as we go here. I worry about Texas's ability or inability to shoot perimeter jump shots, to shoot the three. They're last in the nation in 3-point rate, which means they take fewer 3-point shots than anybody. And in today's college basketball, it's really hard to win that way. The 3-point shot is fundamental now in all walks of basketball. And it cost them last year, quite frankly. NC State, in their Elite Eight matchup, was able to make threes, a lot of them. Texas couldn't play catch up. They couldn't keep up because they were trading 2 for 3 on too many trips down the floor. It cost them the game. So I'm gonna not put Texas on the list. I'm gonna put Notre Dame on the list. I think there's just too much talent there. And when you have good guard play, you have a distinct advantage in the NCAA tournament, and no one has better guard play than Notre Dame with Hannah Hidalgo and Olivia Miles. And my fourth team, I'm gonna go. This is another don't bet against Yukon. Don't bet against Gino Auriemma. Last year, they came in as a 3 seed. It was considered kind of a down year. They'd had a couple of losses. They lost to South Carolina. They were paper thin with their depth. They were playing with 6 players. And guess where they ended up? In the Final Four. And it's funny, I did this is a little quick story. I did predict them to go to the Final Four last year. However, I had them in my bracketology as a 3 seed and all that. So I'm at the Final Four. I'm sitting right before their game against Iowa in the national semifinals. They're doing the player and coaches introductions. I'm right behind the Yukon bench. Gino Auriemma turns around to me and says, "Charlie, you never thought you'd see us here, did you?" And I said, "Coach, no, actually, I predict you'd make the Final Four." He said, "Come on, you had us as a 6 seed all season long. You're crazy." And then he had a little smirk on his face, reached his hand out, shook my hand. He's like, "That's all right. I did too."
That's great stuff.
And that kind of shows just how many times he's done this, that he's so relaxed before a Final Four game that he can turn around and just make fun of me because I'm the person just sitting there. He's got to, I'm gonna bust on Charlie a little bit. Yeah. But that he's been there so many times. He's so relaxed. He's in that moment and that is reflected in how well his team's playing these big games. And he said the other day, prior to the game against South Carolina, he said, "I still think this team's gonna be really good in March." And now, mind you, this is 10 days after they lost to Tennessee and made tons of mistakes in that game and let it get away late. He sees something in this team that is still kind of coming together. I think we saw it really maybe it did come together on Sunday against South Carolina. But if he sees something in this team and he's willing to say that, because he never says stuff like that. If he does, I've got to trust that, given his resume. So I'm going to put Yukon in the Final Four too. There's probably a lot longer answer than you wanted on my Final Four because I had to kind of work it out in my head as we went. But so I guess I'll sum it up: UCLA, South Carolina, Notre Dame, Yukon. There's my Final Four.